Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here, of course, for another poetry discussion. This poetry discussion comes to us from the hallowed pages of the dirty old man himself, Pleasures of the Damned by Charles Bukowski. The poem in question is called The Lady in Red, and it reads as such. People went into vacant lots and pulled up greens to cook, and the men rolled Bull Durham or smoked wings, 10 cents a pack. And the dogs were thin, and the cats were thin, and the cats learned how to catch mice and rats, and the dogs caught and killed the cats, some of the cats. And the gophers tore up the earth, and people killed them by attaching garden hoses to exhaust pipes of their cars, sticking the hoses into the gopher holes, and when the gophers came out, the cats and the dogs and the people were afraid of them. They circled and showed their long, thin teeth. Then they stopped and shivered, and as they did, the cats rushed in, followed by the dogs, followed by people raised chickens in their backyards. And the roosters were weak, and the hens were thin, and people ate them if they didn't lay eggs fast enough. And the best time of all was when John Dillinger escaped from jail. And the saddest time of all was when the lady in red fingered him, and he was gunned down coming out of that movie. Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, Machine Gun Kelly, Ma Barker, Alvin Karpis, we loved them all. And there were always wars starting in China, and they never lasted long, but the newspapers had big black headlines, War in China. The 30s were a time when people had very little, and there was nothing to hide behind. And that Bull Durham tag dangling from the string coming out of your pocket, that showed you had it. You could roll with one hand, plenty of time to practice, and if somebody looked at you wrong or said something you didn't like, you cracked him one right in the mouth. It was a glorious non-bullshit time, especially after we got rid of Herbert Hoover. So, I think when talking about this poem, the obvious place to start is the title, The Lady in Red. Why name this poem The Lady in Red? And I think in order to really talk about why name this poem The Lady in Red, it's important to start with the rest of the poem and understand why the Lady in Red is such a villainous character herein. So, what we have going on here is we have this long explication of the 30s. And we don't know it's the 30s yet. We don't know it's the 30s until 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the seventh to last line. There's 7 lines left in the poem by the time that we learn that that we're in the 30s. There's probably 50 lines here. And in this long explication at the very beginning of this poem, there's all of this murder. Well, the cats murder the mice, then the dogs murder the cats, and then the people murder the gophers, but they don't really murder the gophers, they draw them out to be murdered. So they're secondhand murdering, right? It's a little bit of extension there, but not much. And then we even end the poem with a little bit more violence. It was a no bullshit time. In the event that somebody said something cross to you, well, you got these 2 things to shut them up. And if you can't shut them up with these, then they don't need to be shut up. It's a little more violence at the end there. But during all of this, well, we got the chickens being murdered too by the people, right? Kill them, eat them. All of this killing and murdering going on never really helps anybody out. Nobody gets anywhere because of it. The violence at the end, nobody really gets anywhere because of it. How can I say that? Well, the cats and the dogs, they're still skinny. They're still noted as being skinny. The people are still having to go to vacant lots to pull up greens with which they might cook. all this violence, all of this, the idea that if you want it, take it, right? Never gets anybody ahead. They're still poor. It's still the 30s. Everybody's still in a wretched place. Except John Dillinger. Except Machine Gun Kelly. Except Pretty Boy Floyd and Babyface Nelson, Ma Barker, and Alvin Karpis. They were heroes. Because when they got the idea to take, it wasn't from someone else on the level. No, John Dillinger robbed banks. The banks, that was the rich folk. So this idea of robbing Peter to pay Paul, no one gets ahead. But if you rob Caesar and get away with it, then someone's come out of the system, haven't they? But the lady in red tamped that down. The lady in red fingered old John Dillinger so that he could be gunned down. That's the one right there. But the lady in red. That sounds kind of nice, doesn't it? We're talking about all of these sort of carnal desires, the desire for violence, the desire to murder and eat another living thing, sort of carnal. Sexual carnality. The lady in red. So what you have is you have another desirable thing, which is ruining the day for the ones that escaped the crappy place. It is that irony, I think, that would have led the sort of, how do you want to say it? That would have led the aesthetic, maybe, of Charles Bukowski to name this poem after the Lady in Red, as opposed to John Dillinger, as opposed to naming it Vacant Lot Greens, as opposed to naming it something else, which would be... So, another thing about Bukowski. I've always said, Bukowski is best read, sort of, like a novel. You don't sit down and read a Bukowski poem. You sit down with the Bukowski collection, and you read as long as you might read. And in that way, a lot of times, the poems themselves, the individual poems themselves, are sort of forgettable. Because what's happening is, in typical novel impact, characters are being built. Themes are being run. Almost, really, when you think about it, plots are driving their way through a collection of Bukowski poetry. So oftentimes, the titles of Bukowski poems, like the individual poems, are somewhat forgettable. And I say that as someone who absolutely loves Bukowski. But the titles, normally I could take them or leave them. The individual poems themselves, a lot of forgettable ones. Pull up a collection from Robert Frost, for example. It's this big. Pull up a collection from any of your favorite poets. A collection from a poet is a collection. This is Bukowski. Not in the same way that Emily Dickinson wrote 1,776 poems or whatever. 1,775, I think, is the correct number. But that's her entire canon. Bukowski's poems were more like stories than poems, but they still hinge on some core irony. The irony here in this poem is not really evident, I don't think, until you take a look at that title. The conceit, sort of, in the middle there, is that to these people in this rough spot, in this rough world, in this rough and tumble place, the John Dillingers and the Machine Gun Kellys and the Pretty Boy Floyds and the Babyface Nelsons, these individuals were heroes, and they were the violentest. They were the most violent. So of course they could be the kings and the jacks of this world. The lady in red, not violent. The lady in red sounds awful nice. The lady in red, in a single passive move, takes out the king, right? But not the Caesar king, the people's king. That's why I think this poem is titled the way it is. This poem is titled as sort of the ironic flip. It is titled as the worst thing in a bad world, but it's the worst thing in a violent world with a passive act. That is all I have for this poetry discussion. I hope to have you back for the next poetry discussion here. I do poetry discussions, poetry reviews, short story discussions, short story reviews, novel read-alongs, all of that sort of stuff here on the channel. Opening paragraph, I've got a playlist of opening paragraphs where we just talk about an opening paragraph to a piece for as long as it seems fit to do so. So if you like this sort of thing, it really helps me out here on the channel. If you hit that like button, if you're here by chance but not design, consider hitting that subscribe button and sticking around for more stuff. And I hope to see you here for the next episode.